With that, thanks again for doing this, sir.
Well, thank you for having me back. I didn't realize I hadn't been here since June of 2012. It's taken a couple years to recover, and so I'm back and ready to do it again. But I appreciate the invitation to talk to you about, and I'm sure a lot of things will be on your mind about the speech last night. And I thought I'd use my book as a launch point for what I wanted to discuss with you, because it really goes to the heart of both how I view the speech last night, but also what I hope my work will be about over the next 2 years and in the years to come. So I believe that what sets America apart from the rest of the world, among some other things, our political freedoms are certainly one of them, but equality of opportunity is another, and that's an easy thing to take for granted when you've grown up in this country your entire life and that's all you've ever known. But in most societies that have ever existed, including the ones that my parents and grandparents grew up in, that wasn't necessarily a societal value. In essence, your future was largely determined by where you came from and what your family did before you. And so this idea that somehow in this country, no matter where you come from or who your parents were or what they did, you should have the same opportunity to succeed as everyone else has been not just an enormous influence on my life, but I think a definitive characteristic of America and of our identity. I clearly remember growing up believing that despite the fact that my father was a bartender and my mom was a maid, I could have the same dreams and the same future as the son of a millionaire or even the son of a president. And the fact that this country's made that possible to me is why I want to serve it and try to pay that back, although I doubt I could. In that vein, it troubles me that there are millions of people in this country that don't think that's true anymore. And that is actually getting worse, not better, when they read indicators in the news about how the economy's growing and the stock market is up and unemployment is down, but in their own lives they're not feeling it. Some have dropped out of the labor force because they've become discouraged. Some are working, but they're not being paid nearly enough to keep up with the growing cost of living. Others have done everything we told them you needed to do as far the kind of old-fashioned American formula for success. You went to school, you got a degree, you got a job, and happily ever after. And increasingly, that isn't true anymore. In fact, you see it reflected in our pop culture. There's a song out called American Dreams that it's like a top 40 song, and it says, "Nothing's the way it used to be." It also references Jack and Diane, which is an early 1980s reference to a... But my point to you is that there's the sense that nothing is the way it used to be, that the rules that once led to success no longer apply. And it really frustrates people when they read about how well the economy is doing, but they're not feeling in their own lives. So it falls upon us in public service to try to identify why is that? Why are so many people shut out of this growing prosperity? And the answer is complicated. We would love to blame it on one politician or one political party, but it goes much deeper than that. It is primarily because we're not undergoing a cyclical downturn that we're trying to climb out of. We are undergoing a rapid and dramatic transformation in the very structure of our economy. First, it's a truly global economy. It's no longer a national one. Your competitors, your customers, your clients, your investors are just as likely to be halfway around the world as they are halfway across town. And in addition to that, we have more global competition than ever for investment and for innovation. Other countries are bending over backwards and going out of their way to attract the sort of growth and prosperity that made the American dream possible for so many. So the first thing we have to realize is that in the 21st century, we have more global competition than ever, and that global factors impact us here domestically more than ever. The second is that many of the jobs that once sustained that middle class have been wiped out. They've either been automated or outsourced, or they don't pay enough to live off of. I think it would have been very difficult for my parents to achieve what they did if they had arrived in the United States in 2006 instead of 1956. And that's just a reality that we confront today. Now, the good news is that a lot of these jobs are being replaced potentially by better paying jobs with even more stability and upward mobility. But those new jobs require skills that many people don't have because our education system, our higher education system, is not geared towards teaching it to them in a time-effective and cost-effective way. And the third struggle that we face, of course, is the growing cost of living. And not only do we have higher costs in many staple items of daily life, but we have costs we didn't used to have. You know, a cell phone bill. My parents didn't have a cell phone bill until they were in their 70s. When we were growing up, we didn't have a cable bill until ESPN became a mandatory condition of my continuing residence in that home. My point is, you know, we only had one car. My mom actually never drove. And so all of these new costs that are, and then not to mention higher education. You know, I can tell you that one of the things I hear most often from my students at Florida International University, where I still teach a course, is this frustration that their parents make too much money to qualify for financial aid, but not enough money to be able to afford to pay for it. And that's at a state school. And for me, it's something that's deeply personal because I never could have gone to college had it not been for Pell Grants, but also significant student loans. When I was done with law school, I owed over $100,000. When we first got married, my student loans were about $1,400 a month. They were our single largest item. And my wife wanted to know who was the Sally Mae that kept taking money out of our account. So that's a real struggle and for a lot of people. So these three things, the higher cost of living, the global competition that we're not winning as often as we once did, and the inability of our higher education system to cost effectively give people the skills they need have conspired against middle-class life and upward mobility in America. And that's a central feature of our time that we have to confront. Related to that, although a separate topic and one that I think is a predominantly federal obligation, is our national security threats. And our national security threats, for someone like me who grew up at the tail end of the Cold War era, who came of age in the post-Cold War era where America was a unipolar world where there really was no other nation or power that could challenge our interests, to where we stand today, which is a threshold moment in a new global order, this is an interesting time if you care about foreign policy. So certainly since the end of World War II, we've had a global order of affairs between nations that have largely kept us from having a third world war. There's been wars and conflicts and but we've been able to avoid what in the first half of the 20th century plunged the world into war twice. And what's happening now is that world order is meeting up against some dramatic global shifts. The first is you have the rise of a new power in China that looks at the world order quite differently than we do. First, they say we didn't write those rules. Second, we don't feel like we need to adhere to them. And culturally, the global order runs counter to many of their own views of their role on the planet. For much of Chinese leadership, the last 150 years is an aberration. They like to talk about the thousands of years before that, where they viewed themselves as the center of the universe, and the value of another country was based on their proximity to China. And that still finds itself embedded in some of the political thought in China today. Then you have Russia that's decided the global order is something they could ignore in impunity because there's no one there that will enforce it against them. And in particular, Putin has decided that not only has he made the geopolitical decision that the West is now a threat, but he's also made the decision that no nation in his perimeter could turn westward. They all have to be in his sphere of influence. And he's prepared to enforce that using his military force. And he knows that there's no counterweight to it. And he's basically challenging NATO's purpose in the 21st century. Then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea. We can talk more about Iran later because they're not simply a nation state. They are, as Henry Kissinger has called them, a cause in the minds of the Ayatollah. But two nation states in Iran, rogue states in Iran and North Korea that have figured out that if they acquire nuclear capability, they become immune from the enforcement of the global order against them. And then last but not least, you have the non-state actors around the world who are trying to replace the existing global order with one that basically puts everyone under their radical version of their religion. So it's an interesting time to be involved in public service, and all these things frame the debates that we're having in Washington today.
Thanks for doing that. I think I'm going to hold my question, and we'll start with Phil Elliott of the AP, Chris Adams of the McClatchy, Phil Rucker of the Post, Neil Monroe of the Daily Caller, John Gizzi, Newsmax, John Stanton of BuzzFeed, David Lauder of the LA Times, and Manu Raju of Politico. Phil.
Thanks. Senator, you spoke about having the opportunity growing up of a billionaire or even the son of another president. Speaking of the son of a president, have you spoken with Governor Bush about his potential run, and what does that do with your thinking about a campaign or your timing?
Well, we spoke, not necessarily on point, but about other items that we have mutual interest in and so forth. So I've made a habit of not talking to, when I talk to someone on the phone privately who's my friend, I made a habit of not holding press conferences about it. As far as my thinking, look, I think Jeb Bush is going to be a very credible candidate. I think he's going to raise a lot of money. I saw recent projections that he's going to raise $100 million or so. I think he can easily do that and more. He's got an extraordinary network of donors around the country, and I know that he'll be a strong candidate if he runs. From my perspective, the decision that I have to make is where's the best place for me to serve this country at this time in my life and at this time in my career. And the choice before me is to continue in the Senate, especially now that we hope to hold an enduring majority, or do it in the presidency. And both of those avenues have their own set of opportunities that are alluring. But ultimately, I know I need to make a decision in due time if I want to be able to mount a credible campaign for the presidency, which I believe we can do irrespective of who else is in the race. And so that's where I am in my thinking with regards to that as of today.
Are you going out to California, to Palm Springs this weekend as reported, to meet with the Koch brothers and their group?
Well, I don't know if I'll meet with the Koch brothers. I certainly intend to speak to the group as I've done in the past when I was a candidate, and again earlier this year. There's a lot of people there that were supportive of my candidacy on an individual level. So anytime I have a chance to talk to people about my agenda to move forward, I'm going to, if it fits within our schedule, we're going to take that opportunity.
Mr. Adams.
Senator and Miami Herald. I know you sent a letter to Secretary of State Kerry about the Cuban talks this week. There was another letter from several prominent Republicans and Cuban Americans and South Floridians about those talks. And basically they were saying, like the Van Hools and Carlos Saladrega, they were basically far more optimistic about the prospects for this helping the Cuban Americans. And I was hoping you could contrast your views with what they're saying.
Well, I mean, I certainly respect a lot of those folks, and they have a right to their opinion, and I have no doubt that they sincerely desire freedom for Cuba. My problem is I can't think of a single contemporary example where a reluctant tyranny has become a democracy as a result of an economic opening. In fact, the three contemporary examples that are often cited prove my point. The first is China, where most favored nation status did not lead to a democratic opening. On the contrary, it's led to the most well-funded tyranny in human history. In Vietnam, where a diplomatic and economic opening has not led to political change for the people. And in Burma, where a number of changes were made a year ago or 2 years ago in exchange for diplomatic recognition, they actually agreed to some democratic openings, and now all that's being eroded and taken back. So I can think of no contemporary example where a reluctant tyranny has suddenly become, or over a period of time became democratic because of an economic opening, because they were flooded with tourists and interaction. The second is understanding the true nature of the Cuban regime. Just because we want to sell a bunch of things to them doesn't mean they don't get to choose who comes in. And so just because you allow more visitors to the island doesn't mean they're going to allow anyone who wants to visit. Just because you allow more business activity doesn't mean they're going to allow every business activity to occur. Just because you provide more internet capability doesn't mean Cubans are going to be allowed access to whatever they want. They totally control their end of whatever engagement we have with them. And they're going to continue to do so because their interest is the permanence of the system they have in place. And it's no longer about communism. It's about the fact that you have these old high-level bureaucrats or high-level individuals in their government that are personally benefiting from the status quo, and all of their children and family members who live off of an economy that's entirely controlled by the Cuban government.
Phil Rucker from the Post.
Senator, in your book and also in some interviews that you've done over the last couple of years, you've made a generational argument about Hillary Clinton. You've said her ideas are outdated, she's outdated from the last century, that some of the leading presidential contenders in your party, Mitt Romney, Mike Huckabee, Jeb Bush, also came of age politically in the same time. And I'm wondering if you apply that same assessment to them or how you view them differently.
Yeah, first of all, it doesn't matter when you were born. You can be, older and have modern ideas. My problem is that in order to have ideas that are going to work, they have to be relevant to the 21st century. And you have to understand the structural changes that occurred in our country. To basically say we're going to take policies from the 1990s or even from 2005 and apply them to our current circumstances don't work as well because the issues are different. For example, pouring more money into higher education as it currently exists is not going to solve our problem. Because the problem we have with our higher education system today is as follows. First, having a degree is no longer enough. You have to have the right degree. If you graduate with a degree that doesn't lead to a job, you've just borrowed a bunch of money for nothing. Second, you've got to be able to allow people who have to work full-time and raise a family, who are in their 30s, 40s, mid to late 20s, to be able to acquire the skills they need for a better paying job. So a graphic example of that would be a receptionist at a law firm who makes $15 an hour, and he or she is a single parent. The only way they're ever going to be able to get a raise of significance to change their lives is to become, say, a paralegal. But to become a paralegal, you have to go to school. Do we have, I'm okay, thank you. Do we have an higher educational system flexible enough that allows people who have to work 8 hours a day and raise a family to also be able to acquire the education they need to become a paralegal and improve their skills in life? And that's what we should be investing money into, is innovative new ways to achieve that. And there are multiple ways to do that. I've talked about accreditation and the fact that we should be able to package learning in America. Learning is learning no matter where you acquired it. So if you have 10 years of work experience, 4 years of military service, unpaid internships, subjects that you've mastered on your own, online coursework, and maybe 30 credit hours that you've been carrying for 10 years from when you used to go to community college, someone should be able to package all of that learning into the equivalent of a degree that allows you to become employable and that is recognized by the private sector. That's kind of already happening. Government, I think, is an obstacle to it because we won't pay for it. In government service, we still don't recognize it. Many in the private sector are already recognizing those sorts of alternative ways of learning. My point is, pouring more money into the same system alone is not going to be enough. Just because you get to go to community college and get an associate in arts degree doesn't mean you're going to get a raise. Because an AA for most people is just a gateway to a bachelor's degree, which may or may not make sense, depending on what your goals in life are. You may be better served in a career training program in a community college or somewhere else that allows you to become a welder or an electrician or a BMW technician. And by the way, those are skills you can teach people in high school as well, so they're job ready when they graduate. That's just one example of the sort of modern thinking that I think is important for us to focus on, and not simply say we're going to pour more money into existing structures and institutions that are no longer responsive to 21st century realities.
Neil Monroe?
Thanks very much for doing this. So you're talking a lot about education as a fix for opportunity and wage stagnation, but you've signed on to the I-squared bill that brings in an unlimited number of average foreign graduates for average jobs sought by the average children of all the middle-class people you deal with. That's medicine, business, academia, even the media. So will your I-squared bill and the middle-class worries about opportunity and wage stagnation make it harder to strike a deal with Obama? And how will outsourcing professional middle-class jobs help your poll rating?
Well, a couple points. First of all, that's exactly what's going to happen unless we make immigration reforms for multiple reasons. The first is just because someone says they have a degree in high tech doesn't mean it's relevant to the specific job opening that someone's looking for. You have to have the right tech degree for the right skills that they're looking for. The second is, even today under a restricted system as it exists, you still have thousands of job openings in technology that go unfilled. If in fact there were domestic workers prepared to do that work, they would be hired. These companies wouldn't just sit there with those openings. The likelier outcome is that increasingly companies are opening their work facilities in other nations, for example Canada, where they can attract the workforce. Even more troubling for us as an economy is, if today you are a college graduate and you are 7'1" and can dunk a basketball and you're one of the best basketball players in the world, we're going to keep you in the NBA. But if somehow you're the leading graduate of a high-tech program, educated in the United States, that we spent money to educate, we're going to force you to leave and that's take your expertise to another nation. We can't continue to lose out on the talent that's actually growing up among us here. And the last point is, each one of these jobs has an exponential effect of creating more jobs. Because when you can fully staff a technology company in the US as opposed to forcing them to move to another nation where they can attract the workforce to be there, that creates jobs because they become consumers. These are jobs that on average pay $75,000, $80,000, and they become homeowners, they become consumers in the marketplace. So I certainly think, and I would hope that more American graduates go into these fields. There are certainly people out there that have received those degrees, some of which, for example, don't want to relocate to where the job opening might be. Others, perhaps the skills don't match up. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the fact that there are significant, in the thousands of job openings in technology today that go unfilled despite current restrictions. And that leads us to believe that there's the disconnect between the need and the availability of workers. Companies aren't just going to sit there and let those spots go unfilled if in fact there were all these people ready to take those jobs. So that's why I think it's important for us to modernize our system in that way.
Mr. Gizzi?
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. The Senator, you spoke of continuing your career in public service either as president or in the United States Senate. Now,
or commissioner of the National Football League, you know, because of Deflategate.
Barring that, Florida has a filing deadline for federal office that's May 2nd through the 6th. And as I understand the law in your state, you cannot run for 2 offices at the same time, as 4 Democratic senators have done in the past half-century. Do you have a timetable on deciding which office you will seek in 2016?
Well, my view, as I've described it, is if I decide that I want to be president of the United States, that's what I'm going to run for. And I think if you run for president, that's what you want to be, and that's what you run for, and you focus on that. Because you've made the decision that at this time in your life, that is the best place for you to serve your country. And if I decide to make that decision, it will not be with the intention of looking for a plan B if it doesn't work out.
So you'll give up your Senate seat then? If you
Yeah, I mean, I won't be able to run for real. At that point, I would imagine we'll have multiple Republicans running for the nomination and seeking it on their own. So my plan is not to run for president, and if I don't succeed, qualify for the Senate. That is not my plan. That is not my intention. My intention, if I run for president, is to run for president.
John Stanton of BuzzFeed.
Yesterday, Steve King referred to Dreamers as deportables, and I was hoping you might be able to respond to that and sort of get your take on that, but also the broader question of, it seems like the party has started to move backwards from where it was maybe 2 years ago on the issue of immigration and on the issue of immigrants and trying to deal with the 11 million that are here undocumented. And I want to know if you have any concerns about what you see as the possible path forward to deal with
Well,
that.
I've made a habit of not, I mean, I don't think that I need to be in a position of responding to every statement that every member of my party makes. Suffice it to say that I believe that that describes to some extent one of the issues that we confront when we debate this issue. On the one hand, we are a sovereign nation, and like every nation on earth, not only do we need to have immigration laws, but we must have immigration laws. And this idea that somehow our immigration laws need to be ignored is quite frankly ridiculous. Every country in the world has immigration laws, including many of the nations that people are coming here from. Mexico has immigration laws, Guatemala has immigration laws, Honduras has immigration laws. Every nation on earth has immigration laws, and they fully enforce them. I would go on to say that our existing immigration laws, despite its flaws, is the most generous in the world. 1 million people a year immigrate to the U.S. legally, permanently. That's an extraordinary figure that has no comparison anywhere in the world right now. And so that's a fact. And so we need to understand that part of it. We have immigration laws, we have a right to have immigration laws that limit and restrict who and how many people can come into this country. And if you're in violation of those laws, you should not be claiming that you have some sort of right to have the law ignored. On the flip side of it, we have to always remind ourselves that we're talking about human beings with hopes and dreams and families, and there are human stories behind all of this. And we have to understand that when we're speaking about this, we're not just talking about numbers or statistics. We're talking about real people, some of whom have arrived in this country as infants, who made no decision to come here. They were brought here. Does that mean that the law shouldn't be applied to them? In most cases, probably not. We still need to be able to apply the law because it does create incentives for others to do the same thing in the future. But I also think we can recognize that and also recognize the human value of every individual who seeks a better life, and in that understand that at some point in our own lineage, someone had the same hopes and dreams and came here, in most cases, primarily through the laws that existed at that time. So I think you can be for an immigration system that works and that is enforced and still recognize the human value and dignity of individuals that perhaps find themselves here, in some cases through no fault of their own, illegally. As far as the way forward on immigration, I can tell you how we're not going to be able to do it, and that's in one big bill. And I can tell you that with tremendous confidence because I tried it, and it didn't work. And here's why it doesn't work. Because people do not believe that the enforcement will ever happen. They believe that you will go ahead and do the legalization, but the enforcement will never occur, and in 10 years we'll have another 10 million people here illegally. And so I believe that the only path forward that has any chance of success is first to bring illegal immigration under control, to prove to the American people that not only are we serious about enforcing our immigration laws, but that we are enforcing them, and that in fact this problem is now under control. Second is you've got to modernize your legal immigration system so that it's one that makes sense. For example, I think it should be a more merit-based system. And the Senate bill moved in that direction. Perhaps it should move even further in that direction. And I say that to you as someone whose parents came here on a family-based system. But I recognize that 2015 looks dramatically different from 1956. Our economic needs are different, our economic life is different. And to the extent that we're going to allow 1 million people to come here permanently every year, it should weigh more towards merit and their ability to contribute economically than simply whether or not they have a relative living here. I imagine there will always be a family reunification component of immigration, but I think it should lean more towards the merit basis. Once you've done those two things, then I believe you can have a very reasonable and responsible conversation about how do you address the fundamental fact that you have 12 million human beings living here, many of whom have been here for longer than a decade, who have, other than violating immigration laws, have not otherwise violated our laws. And I think that most people understand that most of them are going to be here for the rest of their lives. And I think you can create a system where people come forward and pay a fine and undergo background checks and then reside in a probationary status that allows them to work and little else for nothing, no voting rights or citizenship rights for a significant period of time. and then thereafter allow them access to the legal immigration system, but not through a special pathway, but the same pathway everybody else would use. I honestly believe you can get support for that, but I don't think you can ever get to that third phase until you've gone through the first two that I've described. And that's not anything other than a tactical reality. I mean, we've tried that other approach of comprehensive on 3 different occasions in the last decade, and all 3 have met with failure, and I believe they will continue to meet with failure because people have zero confidence that the federal government is serious about enforcing immigration law. They'll believe it when they see it.
Can I ask you a follow-up question, then we'll go to David Lauder. Follow-up question on immigration based on something you told Jim Rutenberg of the New York Times. And the question was about those who think the GOP needs an immigration solution before 2016. And you said to him, those who argue that this will be a bonanza for Republicans are not telling the truth. Those who argue that we should do it for the purpose of politics are also misanalyzing the issue, unquote. So is it your view that the Republican Party can succeed in national elections while taking positions that Hispanics view as hostile? I mean, the enforcement first argument.
I don't agree that Hispanics view that position as hostile. I mean, I think this notion that somehow Hispanics don't want the law enforced or law to exist on immigration less than the general population is not true. The vast majority of people in the Hispanic community are law-abiding. The enormous majority are law-abiding, and they understand we have to have immigration laws. The majority of immigrants in this country came legally. The majority of phone calls to my office on immigration are not illegal immigrants calling for assistance. It is legal immigrants or people trying to achieve legal immigrant status who have been waiting for 9 to 12 years and are frustrated that they just read that someone who violated the law is going to get here before them. So I think that cuts both ways. There's a tremendous amount of frustration in the community that I live in. There's a lot of people from Latin America that their relatives are trying to do it the right way, and they're going to have to wait 10 or 14 years and spend a lot of money doing it. And someone who violated the law gets to come here and stay permanently, and they feel that that's unfair. I do think that you've got to be careful about how you talk about the issue for the reasons I outlined a moment ago. You're talking about human beings. And when you're talking about real people with real hopes, real dreams, real tragedy, and so forth, you have to be sensitive about it, and you have to recognize, I think you can have empathy for what people are going through and still say we need to have an immigration system that is enforced and makes sense for the country. As far as the politics of it, I have never viewed immigration as a way to win elections. I've just viewed it as a way for the country to do what it needs to do, the right thing. And it's important for our country, it's important for economic growth, it's important for stability, it's important for national security to have an immigration system that works. And I'm not, I think if you do the right thing, the politics ultimately at some point takes care of itself. But I've never believed that somehow we needed to do immigration reform in order to win an election. On the contrary, I've always seen the potential pitfalls politically for someone to get involved in the issue, and I've experienced it myself.
David Lauder of the LA Times.
Senator, when I read your book, one of the things that I was...
Which one, the first one or the second
No,
one?
the current.
Okay, good. You got to read the first one, too. That's how I paid off my loan.
I read the first one, but focusing on the new one. One of the things that I was struck by was that some of the passages where you're describing the middle-class economic squeeze, if you tore the pages out and didn't have the cover photo, the language would be pretty much the same that you could expect to see from Senator Warren, Secretary Clinton, or several other people in the Republican Party too. And I'm struck by this sort of consensus about what the definition of a problem, and obviously the policy prescriptions are different. But the consensus that seems to be growing about the problem of middle-class stress is fairly new. And even a few years ago, there was a lot of disagreement about whether this really is the problem. And I wonder why you think that has developed that way, and whether it puts your party at somewhat of a disadvantage arguing about an issue that's generally in the past been considered to be Democratic turf.
Well, I think the reason why is because about 8 years ago, everybody was in trouble, not just the middle class. I mean, everybody was upside down, everybody was hurting, every segment of the economy, for the most part, was in trouble. I think what's happened over the last few years is we've seen a recovery at the upper echelons of the economy. So people that are in industries that are progressing, or people that have connections to government, or people who are established industries, that have the wherewithal to deal with whatever the circumstances may be. So I think what's really happened now is that so much of the recovery over the last couple of years has gone to such a small segment of the population that now that middle class and upward mobility stagnation has become more apparent as people are being left behind in that regard. So I think it's good that there's a consensus that that's what we need to focus on. I think the debate needs to be about how you do it and what's the best approach to it. And the criticism I have of the left is primarily it has been a series of tax increases to redistribute wealth and more spending into existing government programs, as opposed to viewing it as we need to create the conditions for even more rapid economic growth, but also the underlying conditions to allow that growth to reach more people because they have the right skills, because the jobs are being created that they would fill, because the right industries are being attracted or maintained in America. And I think that's the age-old debate between free enterprise and limited government and a more activist government role in our society. And I think that'll be a good debate for America. And that's the relevant issue of our time. So the more the Republican Party focuses on it, the more relevant our policy prescriptions will be to everyday Americans.
Manu, Raju, Filippo?
Senator, you're already hearing arguments from some in your party that next time in 2016 it would make sense to elect a governor rather than a senator. You've often pointed out your experience is longer than your one term in office here in Washington. But what is the case that you make to your party that you would have the executive experience to run a sprawling bureaucracy and that the party would not be making a gamble in electing you?
Well, if I was a governor, I'd make the same argument too. And I think a lot of those people making the arguments happen to be governors. But I would just remind everyone that we do have governors that have made great presidents, and we have quality candidates around this country that happen to be governors that I think will be or former governors, who I think will be very credible presidential candidates. But I believe that the central obligation of the federal government, above all the other issues that we're going to discuss here today, is providing for the national security. You can't have middle class prosperity if your national security is threatened. You can't have economic growth if your national security is being threatened. And so we need to have, the next president of the United States needs to be someone that has a clear view of what's happening in the world, a clear strategic vision of America's role in it, and a clear tactical plan for how to engage America in global affairs. And I think for governors, that's going to be a challenge, at least initially, because they don't deal with foreign policy on a daily basis. And obviously, I've only been in the Senate now for 4 years and 2 months, but I've certainly been very engaged in the political, in the national security and foreign policy debates. Primarily, one, because I enjoy it, but two, because I think of how important it is. I think that is the predominant obligation of the federal government, is to provide for our national security and to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. And I feel very comfortable discussing and debating that with any of the potential candidates or anyone else who might want to be president.
Robert Schlesinger, U.S. News.
Going back to the Cuba question, you mentioned the 3 examples that we've engaged and that hasn't changed. Flipping it around, should we then impose a Cuba-style embargo or otherwise withdraw from those countries since engagement hasn't worked?
Well, part of foreign policy, I believe that foreign policy needs to be deeply morally based, but I also think there's a role to play for pragmatism and geopolitical consideration. So the comparison on a geopolitical front, the comparison between China and Cuba is really not a fair one. China is the most populous nation on earth. It is now, by some accounts, the largest or second largest economy on the planet. It is a very significant rising power in the new global order. And to say we geopolitically can treat China the same way as we treat Cuba is just not true. Vietnam falls in the same category. In fact, our engagement with Vietnam was partially due to the hopes of getting them to withdraw troops from Cambodia at the time, which they did, but it also had to do with this geopolitical sensitivities of the Asia-Pacific region between China and its neighbors. And that doesn't mean that we should stop calling for human rights in those nations. And it's troubled me that that realism has gone as far as to prevent the president, when he travels to China, from bringing up or raising the issues of human rights, or Vietnam for that matter. So I've been a strong critic of China's human rights abuses, while recognizing that a nation of that stature with a massive nuclear arsenal, a growing military force, and the second largest economy in the world is not a nation we can just ignore on the global stage, and quite frankly, not a nation that we could impose successful sanctions on anyways. And that's just a fact. When it comes to Cuba, it's a whole different dynamic in the sense that it is a small island, although important to me and to many Americans, but it's 90 miles from our shores. And I would remind everyone that in the last decade and a half, every nation in the Western Hemisphere, except one, has had free and fair elections. Now, it's eroded in places like Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, But every nation, and all I ask for is the Cuban people get the same chance to have a free and fair election, to have an open democratic process. And it's a nation we can have to influence over. And I would also argue that from a geopolitical realism perspective, it is not in the national security interest of the United States to have an anti-American tyranny 90 miles from our shores. It is ironic that on the day when today, as those discussions begin between US diplomats and Cuban diplomats, or whoever they're sending to these talks, a Russian spy ship is an open view in the port of Havana for all to see. We should not forget that in every international forum that they're members, Cuba constantly votes against the national security interests of the United States, aligning themselves with Iran and Assad, and before that, Gaddafi. And we cannot ignore those facts either. So I just think that there's a missed opportunity there. I really believe that the sanctions we have on Cuba and the sanctions we had before these changes served as leverage points that we could use to secure for the Cuban people democratic openings. And I think that if a policy that the president undertook had been reciprocal, in essence, in exchange for more travel to Cuba, you would agree to liberalize the opportunity for alternative methods of the press, that in exchange for more remittances to Cuba, you would allow for people to organize independent political parties, reciprocal steps. That would have been one approach. But to simply give away everything the Cubans are asking for in the hope that American tourism and American dollars are going to lead to a political change on the island is wrong-headed in my mind, and I think actually sets back the cause of achieving democracy on the island.
Alexis Levinson?
I wanted to ask you, we've all asked you about a possible
A little louder for the old in the crowd.
I wanted to ask you about, we've all asked you about your presidential run. I wanted to ask you about if you were to run for Senate, or if you don't run for Senate, who you'd like to see. You mentioned a lot of Republicans would probably be lining up for that seat if you...
In Florida? Who would I want to see run?
Who would you like to see run?
I haven't even thought about that. You know, obviously we have a number of Republican statewide elected officials. We have talented people like the former Speaker of the House, Will Weatherford. We have a lieutenant governor in Florida who's a close friend and very talented as well, but I really haven't given that much thought. And I don't think you'll have a shortage of quality candidates is my point. And there could be someone out there now that we haven't even mentioned. I mean, I certainly was not viewed as a top-tier candidate early in that race.
If you did run for Senate, could you kind of handicap what you think that race looks like with you on the Republican?
It'll be competitive. I mean, Florida's a swing competitive state in a presidential cycle. It won't be a cakewalk by any measure, but we think we have a good story to tell, and we think we'll be effective at communicating it if that's a decision that I make.
In the remaining 15 minutes or so, we're going to try and get in 4 questions. Heidi from Bloomberg. I'm not going to try the last name because I just embarrass myself when I do. Linda Feldman from The Monitor. Michael Barbaro from The New York Times. And we'll finish with Jeff Zeleny from ABC. Heidi?
Hi.
Thank you.
Some Republicans are worried that by not only attacking Obama's recent executive orders, but also DACA, that the House is basically playing right into the hands of Democrats in 2016. Do you personally support rolling back DACA as well? And how do you think Obama's orders should be handled now that the Senate is going to have to take this up?
Well, I'm not in favor of what the president did. DACA meaning basically the dreamers. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not in favor of what he did. One, because I think it proves the point that the government's not going to enforce the law, and second, because I think it was counterproductive to the efforts at reform. I think it actually sets back the efforts at reform. And I don't believe that new applicants should be admitted to the program. I think people that are in the program until the program expires, I wouldn't call for. At this point, it would be so disruptive to just suddenly cut everybody off, but I don't think we should be enrolling new people in the program at this stage. At some point, that program needs to stop enrolling new people. As far as the new decision that was made, you know, I will support any method that has a chance of success. And I think we should try to stop this new executive order from kicking in, but I would prefer we spend most of our energy doing what we should be doing anyway, which is passing a security bill, one that allows us to enforce our immigration law, moving second to an issue of modernizing our legal immigration issue. And then finally, once those 2 things are in place, having a debate about what to do with those who are here illegally in a way that's reasonable yet responsible. I would prefer that we would spend the majority of our time actually acting on our immigration reform platform, although I would support efforts to roll back the new executive order if in fact that we can make it happen.
So it sounds like supporting efforts, like you said, to roll back the new orders, but that you're not really keen on attacking the 2012 orders?
Well, the 2012 order has to come to an end at some point. That executive order will expire at the end of his presidency. What I'm saying is that in the interim, we shouldn't be signing up additional people. At some point, that program's enrollment needs to stop. And I don't think we should be enrolling new people. If you haven't signed up for DACA by now, you know, what have you, you know, so I think that program clearly has to come to an end at some point. It cannot be the permanent policy of the United States of America. And I thought it was wrong for him to make that decision in the first hand.
Linda?
Thank you. Senator, I wonder if you could talk a bit about your thought process on whether you'll run for president this time. In particular, what you're thinking about the idea of raising young children in the White House. Have you done research on that? What your wife thinks?
Well, my family is prepared to support whatever decision I make. The good news is that you know, if I am in the White House, I'll live above the shop, so to speak. I mean, you'll see your family more in essence than I do today. But it's a very demanding job, and I have no illusions about it. There is no job in the world quite like it. There is no job in the world that prepares you for it. In fact, if you look at the history of presidents, they almost always improve in office. I've always been fascinated by, and this year actually visited the Kennedy Library with the help of Ambassador Kennedy, who helped set that up for me, and got to listen to about an hour of tape. So I've always been very fascinated by the evolution of JFK's thinking between the Bay of Pigs in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how he was able to grow from the lessons of the Bay of Pigs to learn how to question, not simply take it as carte blanche, whatever the military officials told him. And we know now, if you listen to the tapes and the deliberations that occurred in the Oval Office, if he had listened to the advice of his military officials in that room, some of them anyways, without some level of skepticism, there would have been World War III. We know that there was in fact a nuclear device on the island. We know that in fact one of the submarines that was approaching the quarantine zone was armed with nuclear rockets and was almost disconnected from the Kremlin. In essence, a rogue commander could have launched that attack. So we came real close, knowing now, and had he gone forward with an invasion or an airstrikes as had been called upon by some of the military officials, we would have had a third world war, and highly questionable whether we would be sitting in this room here today. So he grew from that experience, and he learned lessons from that. And I think that's the lesson of most presidencies. As far as the thought process behind it, I'm down to the last decision, and I think a fundamental one, and that is, at this stage in my life, at this stage in my career, where is the best place for me to serve the country? And that's a unique decision that few people are asked to make, and it's one that you want to make sure you make the right choice on and think carefully about. It's an irreversible one once you make it. So that's what when I have time to think about it, that's what I think about. And I know we'll have to make a decision if we intend to run for president soon enough to be able to mount the sort of credible campaign that it takes to win a national race.
And given that you're so young, could you see yourself possibly staying in the Senate and then running for governor of Florida to beef up your executive?
I've never discussed that with.
Never thought about it.
Just I don't think in those terms. I mean, I really never have in terms of can I run for this to run for that. When I was the Speaker of the Florida House, I mean, that was a graveyard for politicians in Florida. I mean, when you were Speaker, you were done forever. I mean, and I was told that repeatedly. But I wanted to be Speaker. I wanted to lead that body. I'm proud that I did, and I was out of office. I thought, quite frankly, I would never be able to run for office again in the near future. There were no openings in Florida when the Senate opportunity emerged. And even then, it was highly questionable whether I could win. So I've never calculated in those terms. I don't do so now. I think if you do a good job at whatever it is you're doing, whether in the private sector or in public office, opportunities present themselves. But that's not something we've considered in terms of the future. I don't have a 10-year plan for political progress. I just deal with the opportunities as they emerge.
Michael Bavaro from the New York Times.
Senator, you campaigned with Governor Romney. A bunch of us saw you on the campaign trail in 2012, and you're no doubt thinking about kind of what it would take to run for president, what your message would be. Looking back on that race, looking back on Governor Romney, what were the flaws of that candidacy?
Well, I don't necessarily think there were flaws in that candidacy. I think oftentimes we forget that in these campaigns, about 90% of the outcome is determined by the blocking and tackling of politics, the tactical ground level moves. And I think the Obama campaign was a superior campaign operation. I mean, they had the time and the resources to build a network of data that they were able to execute on. They were able to do something that no modern presidential campaign has done, and that is use turnout as a way to change the outcome of an election. I mean, that's always been the pipe dream of political consultants forever. We're going to change the turnout model, and that's going to change the outcome. But he actually was able to achieve that twice, which is a testament to their political acumen. And I just think they had a better organization at the end of the day. I do think, and this is not a criticism of Mitt Romney, this is a general observation, that before people will listen to what you have to say, they need to know that you understand what they're going through, that what you're speaking about is relevant to their daily lives. And I think that's a challenge for politicians always, but certainly in the modern era more so, at a time when so many people are struggling to get ahead, where so many people feel like they've done everything they were told they needed to do to get ahead and they're still not getting ahead. I think it's important not just to understand that and identify that with that, but then to have policies that actually speak to it in an effective way. And I'm not sure that's a lesson from 2012. I think that's an enduring lesson in general for those of us who aspire to serve, that if we want to have the opportunity to do so, you better be focused on issues that are relevant to real people. And that's one of the reasons why when I was Speaker of the House, I undertook the 100 Ideas Project, where we traveled the state and asked real people what they would do if they were in our position. And from it culled a bunch of ideas. We narrowed it down to 100, published a book, and executed on it. Because I always believe politics is at its best when it's focused primarily on the issues that real people are worried about on a daily basis. And I think that's something our party should improve on. But I think both parties need to focus on.
47% self-deportation, no flaws in that campaign?
Look, I don't think those were the determinative factors at the end of the day. I think that the Obama campaign was able to identify a core of supporters, mobilize that core of supporters to vote, and it helped them win in key places. But you know, in terms of our rhetoric on a campaign trail, it's certainly, and this is not just Mitt Romney, it's any candidate, it's certainly not helpful to be viewed as someone who doesn't care about or understand people like you when you're a voter. No matter what they stand for, if someone is someone that you think doesn't understand people like you or care about people like you, it's going to be hard to get your vote. And again, that's not true of Mitt Romney, because I know the person. I've met the man. Not only do I believe he cares about people like that, I know he does. But you're asking me a general concept in politics. I do think that that's something that when your issues are relevant, when you're discussing issues that are relevant to real people, that is the best way to show and convince them that in fact you do understand people like them and are focused on the issues that are important for them.
Jeff Zeleny from ABC.
Senator, first, did you think that Senator Ernst did a better job last night in the GOP response than you did a couple years ago?
Absolutely. There was no interruption. She did a great job.
And secondly, what do you say to ag state senators like her and Ben Sass from Nebraska and some other Republicans who really have a lot of their constituents and interest groups saying that they should take a different approach to Cuba than you're taking? And what do you believe that the political assessment is right now inside the Republican conference of how many Republicans agree with Jeff Flake and disagree with you?
I think the majority of the Republican conference agrees with my position on Cuba. As far as the interests, they're not just in Nebraska or Iowa, they're in Florida. There are interests in Florida that want to do more business. They want to charter more airplanes. They want to buy real estate. I understand that people are interested in Cuba as a market. But my interest in Cuba is about the people. I'm interested in democracy. I think a free Cuban people can decide any economic model they want. There's one I would recommend to them, but that's up to them to decide which economic model they want. My interest in Cuba is singular. I want them to have freedom and democracy. And I want us to use American foreign policy as an influence in that direction. And that's my argument to them, that I want the Cuban people to have the same thing the people in the Dominican Republic have. I want them to have the same thing the people of Honduras have, and the people of Panama have, and the people of Costa Rica have. I want them to have elections and the opportunity to choose their leaders. Not only do I want them to have that, I believe that is a core principle of this nation that believes all people have that right. And we've acted on it repeatedly in our history. And I would hope that I can convince my colleagues that that's more important than the desire of some business interest to go to Cuba and make some bucks. And so, you know, again, I don't know at the end of the day if I'll prevail with every single one of them, but I certainly think the majority of our conference supports my position on this issue. But it's an ongoing process. And I think if there's a silver lining in all of this is that Cuba matters again. For years when I spoke about Cuba, you know, it really didn't get any attention, and most people weren't aware of it or didn't spend much time on it. For the first time, certainly since I've been in the Senate, but maybe in 2 decades, Cuba policy matters again. And that's a unique opportunity for us who believe in the cause of freedom and liberty in Cuba to advocate our position and actually have people pay attention to it.
You said last month that you would hold up funding, or try and hold up funding for the installation of an embassy ambassador. What are your plans specifically in the coming weeks to?
Well, I'm going to be I'm going to be a very cynical observer of that process moving forward. Number one, I don't think we should be funding or adding funding to a facility that isn't a real embassy. A real embassy means your diplomats have freedom of movement. A real embassy means you can send anything you want into that embassy. As many computers as you want, as many You can send diplomats in there. These diplomats are allowed to travel the country and meet with whoever they want. If it's going to be a real embassy, then be a real embassy. But we're not going to fund a fake embassy, basically a facility that we change the sign on the door, but in essence is not allowed to operate in the country. So obviously that's a deeper issue we'll have to have a conversation with the administration about. But as far as I'm concerned, there's a huge threshold in that regard, including the appointment of an ambassador. Is it going to be a real ambassador that's allowed to travel the country and engage with civil society? Or is it just going to be someone that's there by name only?
We've got about 3 minutes left. Miles, do you have a quick one?
Yeah. Senator, on immigration again, do I understand you correctly? You would focus on enforcement of the existing immigration law first, but that would be mostly focused on new illegal entries and not upon those already in the country illegally?
No, I would focus on improving our systems of enforcement that right now are inadequate. For example, there are portions of the border that remain insecure. At least 3 sectors of the border are not truly secure. And we can secure it through a combination of fencing, more personnel, cameras, sensors, etc. That alone will not be enough. 40% of illegal entry into this country happens legally at first. They come on a visa, they overstay. We don't accurately track that. So when you enter the country, we check you in, but when you leave, we don't always check you out. And so as a result, you have a lot of people that have overstayed visas and we have no idea who they are or where they are. And the third component of that, and I think perhaps the most effective of the 3, although all 3 matter and work together, is an E-Verify system that compels and creates for employers a safe harbor, but requires them, before they hire someone, to run that name and that person through a system that verifies whether or not they're in this country legally. And in a system that actually works, if they've overstayed a visa, that would be fed in real time. If they're here on a valid work permit, that would be in the system and tell you that they're legally here to work. Those 3 things work together. I would also argue to you that one of the best enforcement mechanisms is to have a legal immigration system that works. There is a significant percentage of illegal immigration in this country that's driven by the fact that people cannot access the country legally, but that supply is going to meet that demand. You see in agriculture and in some other industries, oftentimes you have people here, I've met with these migrant workers, many of whom have no interest in ever being citizens or even permanent residents of the United States. They want to work here for 9 months out of the year and then go back to their families. But they're afraid to go back because they don't want to have to jump a fence next year and come in again. So that's an example of another thing that we can do. And obviously, look, if someone's in violation of our immigration laws, that law has to be enforced. You don't have a legal right to immigrate here illegally. And people need to understand that you don't have a legal right to argue that you have a fundamental right to be in the country illegally. You don't. Now, you can appeal to our morals. You can appeal to those sorts of make a moral argument, but you can't make a legal argument that you have a right to violate our immigration laws and enjoy permanence in the United States. So I do think you have to enforce the existing law. But I would primarily focus on improving our methods of immigration enforcement, because today those tactics or the methods we have in place are not adequate for the challenge before us.
Thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it, sir, very much. Hope you'll come back.
9:59. You guys are excellent. Very good.
Try,
Thank you.
Try to keep our promises.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Senator.